Imagine growing up in a famous heavy metal studio, like Morrisound in Florida, which has basically recorded the entire classic canon of death metal. Well, you pick things up, you learn a few things, and eventually you're one of the guys at the centre of a musical movement. Today we're going to talk to just one of those guys, Ralph Santola. Now, who's he? His name mightn't sound immediately familiar to you, but in fact, he's been an essential part of bands like Death, Deicide, and Obituary as the go-to guitarist. Now, you'll definitely be familiar with some of his most impressive work. Remember how he saved Deicide's bacon with their whopping comeback album, The Stench of Redemption, when they had their backs against a creative wall? It was Ralph that pulled off this. So this is a guitarist that knows how to play, and he's going to take us back on a trip through the Florida scene through the eyes of two of its most important bands. Now, we had such a good conversation that I've decided to split it up over two episodes. The first one, this one, will focus on his time with Death and the visionary Chuck Schuldiner.
Chuck, after like 2 days, he came on the bus at the end of the night and he's like, Metal Brothers, this is death metal, it's not jazz.
While the second episode next week will focus on his time with Deicide and how he basically saved them from creative ruin, really, no other way to put it. So they're both incredible chats because Ralph is just so honest and so approachable. He's been through a lot lately. Hurricane Irma touched his life and the people he holds dear, so it's been tough. He's also been through some medical issues, and he's just really, really honest and open and just a great guy to talk to. So I hope you enjoy this. Welcome to the Metal Insight Podcast, episode 40, the individual thought patterns of guitarist Ralph Santola. And just a very quick note, there's a great gig you got to get out to coming up in Dublin. It's Frank Carter and the Rattlesnakes. Frank that used to be in Gallows, you'll remember. They're going to be at the Tivoli Theatre on November 28th. So, on with the show. I guess there's a couple of themes I'd like to explore, and I suppose the first and most meaningful, probably to me and a lot of people reading, would actually be your time in Death. And the reason I'm thinking that is I don't know, I've just been listening to a lot again of Death and just going back over old times in my head, listening to a lot of Cynic and stuff like that as well, just remembering that whole time. And I just wanted to ask you, like, what the hell was that like? You know, you did a really good shift with Death. I mean, okay, I know you weren't on the album, but you know, you did tours, and you got a real insight into Chuck and the guys, and I'd just love to share some memories, really, of that time and what you remember.
I've got a million, dude. So you cut me off with the next question when I've said enough.
Okay.
Like, I grew up. I mean, I'm from Tampa, and I grew up at Morrisound. I started recording there when I was 12 years old. That's why I was in all those bands, because all those guys knew me from the studio, because I basically lived at Morrisound, you know, my whole teenage years and in my 20s and stuff. I worked there. I was always there with my bands. I did everything. And plus Jim Morris, he's like my mentor. Like, he started teaching me when I was 12, recording me and teaching me. And so he would always be like, you should get Ralph. When Death was recording individual thought patterns, I was in the other part of Morrisound working with my band Eyewitness. So I would start going to dinner with them every night, because me and Scott Burns were really close friends. And me and Steve DiGiorgio immediately hit it off. The day I met him, it was like lifelong friends, and he's still one of my favorite people. And he's the bass player in my new band, Devil's Highway. And Andy LaRock from King Diamond didn't want to tour for whatever reason. I can't even remember now. It was a long time ago. It was like 25 years ago or something. And so Scott came to me and said, Chuck wants to know if you want to tour for this album they just did. And the way I am, I was like, I had never been on tour before. I was like, sure, sounds like fun. I'm always like that. Sure, let's just do it. So I did it, and a lot of people, because I look a little bit, especially back then, a little bit like Andy LaRock, and people thought that I was him, and it got to the point that I got tired of telling people I'm not Andy LaRock, so I would just start signing. First, I started signing Andy LaRock's name on CDs and posters and shit. Then it got to the point where it's like I just started signing Ace Frehley, Ted Nugent, like just random names. But yeah, dude, Chuck gave me a career. I was a little bit too naive to realize it at the time, but I had an incredible time. And I quit that band because while we're on tour, um, my band got a record deal for Europe and Japan, and I was so naive at the time that I didn't realize that I could do both. I
And
thought I had to choose, so I wanted to do my own music,
but you see, that's a
and
bit
I
strange
chose my
because,
own music, and I quit. That was a big mistake on my part.
well,
Okay,
you
go ahead.
so you could, in an alternate universe, maybe you could have been the guitarist on Symbolic.
Yeah, I could have done that. I mean, but dude, I was just really green. Like, I was very inexperienced. All I ever did my whole life was like sit in the garage or in my bedroom and play guitar and study music. I didn't know, how things worked or anything like that. And, the guys that played after me, like Craig Cicero and Shannon Ham, those guys are my friend. I mean, my friends. I wouldn't want to like take that experience that they had away from them either. They're cool dudes. It's just I quit the band because I thought that's what I had to do, and it was really stupid of me.
And one thing that you see, one thing I find intriguing is that when I listen to Symbolic and I hear the way Bobby Coble um,
He's a
plays.
cool. Wait, I hate to interrupt you. I'm sorry. He's a cool guy and a great musician, also. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I saw him recently on the Death to All tour, and I was just blown away. And what I was going to say was that actually the way you guys both play is very, very similar. Your tones are quite similar, and your attack on the string, on the pick, you're fluid and legato, but at the same time you've got this bite. And actually, you're really, really similar players.
Dude, I can only comment on that because I very rarely listen to other guitar players. So what you're saying may or may not be true. I know this though. When I've seen Bobby play live, he's an excellent musician, and I really like what he does a lot, but I never thought about what you're just saying. I would have to go and listen like deeply to comment on that. But Bobby is a killer guitar player and an awesome dude.
Yeah.
All those dudes, Gene Hoglan, Richard Christie, Bobby, Shannon Ham, Craig, those dudes are really fucking great people, and I like all of them like very, very much. And Steve DiGiorgio, you know, took me under his wing and is one of the best friends that I've ever had in my life and one of my favorite people.
It's amazing. One of the things about Death and I guess the loyalty that the Chuck's legacy inspires among his many fans, it really is a family. And whereas it could look like he always had a rotating cast of great people, but the reason he got the great people was to do the best service to each album. And when you think back to you know Sean Reinert and Paul Masvidal.
That's funny, but go ahead.
Oh yeah, well I just mean like he just got the best people, and there's this family of you guys. But what are you laughing at, Sean Reinert? What's so funny?
Dude, okay. Also, like, Sean is one of the greatest drummers of all time,
Yeah,
and he's an incredibly intelligent person, and he's cool. And Paul Masvidal is super talented and awesome like that too. And Sean Reiner, one time when I was in Obituary, Sean is gay, and like like he knows I give a shit. It has nothing to do with me. So I was at a festival with Obituary and in Austria, I think, and I was walking through like the open air backstage thing, and Sean was standing in the back of the van loading their merch, and he put his hand on his hips and go, "Hand it to me, sailor," or some shit like that, like making a parody of it. And it was so incredible. He did it like looking at me saying it. It was incredibly funny because he knows, I don't give a shit about that. That has nothing to do with me. It was just funny as hell. He's very comfortable in his own skin, but I think he's one of the greatest drummers of all time.
Yeah, it's bizarre, and well, it's not bizarre. It's completely understandable that metal, and certainly death metal, that's got to be a tough room, if I can put it like that.
Like now it's 2017, and a lot of things have been normalized that used to be taboo. Period. I think a lot of that is negative in my opinion, but one thing that is positive is that like gay people can just be themselves. So it must have been extremely difficult back in the early 90s and stuff, when there's like a hyper masculine sort of like music culture, to be that, to be gay or whatever, and have to be around idiots like me all the time, but anyway.
Tell me a little bit more. So, what was it like to actually play with Chuck? I mean, I've seen Steve DiGiorgio play. I've seen Gene play. I've seen a lot of the guys in different environments play, but to actually play in that band, I mean, what was the feel of cracking out like individual thought patterns? And I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you were actually in the video, were you not, for the Philosopher?
Yeah, I was. Yes, sir. I was the really good-looking guy in the video. It was like this, man. Like, I grew up, like I said, at Morristown, and then this whole scene, and I never listened to death metal. I was never into it. I always thought it was unmusical. And then I had to learn Chuck's music, and I realized that he was actually a visionary like Jimi Hendrix or somebody. And so I learned all of this music. Like, he taught me all the songs we were going to play live in the big room at Morristown. And then I would go every day for a while out to Altamont Springs, which, like, I live in Tampa, and Morristown is in Tampa. Altamont Springs is, like, Orlando is, like, an hour from here, and Altamont Springs is about 15 miles or something, like, past that. So I would go there early every morning, and we would rehearse, me, him, Gene, and Steve, in the garage at the house. And I mean, it would be fucking 400 degrees in there, in the garage, just baking. I mean, it's Florida, and then I'd have to drive all the way back. And so I would go out there, and it would be rush hour in the morning when I drive out there, all the way out past Orlando, and then we'd get done, and I'd have to drive back from Orlando, past Orlando, back to Tampa, and it would be the evening rush hour. It totally sucked. But learning his music made me a much, much, much better musician, and it opened my mind a lot. And then, just on the same sort of subject, that first tour that I did with them, and it was the first tour I ever did, it was the Hate Festival or some shit, whatever, but it was Death, Carcass, Cannibal Corpse, Tiamat, and Gorguts. Well, so I met Jack Owen on that tour. He was in Cannibal, and we've been like really, really close since then. Like, As far, I mean, even where he has like a lot of times his holidays at my mother's house, like Thanksgiving and Christmas and stuff like that. I mean, really close. He helped me raise my son, actually. And the first gig was in Hamburg, Germany. And at, at that venue, like the backstage was like underground, it was like a sub level or whatever. And Chuck goes, "Hey, dude, let's go watch Carcass." And I was thinking, I'm not going to like a band called Carcass. But it was my first gig ever with Beth, and we hadn't gone on stage or anything. So I kind of felt like I had to do it. And we went up there, and we went on the side of the stage where Bill Steer was. And that they had already written and recorded Heartwork.
Yeah.
But it wasn't out yet, but they were playing the songs. And I was absolutely fucking, it was life-changing watching them play and hearing Bill and hearing Michael Mott. I mean, it just blew my mind, and it really changed the way I think about, like, writing rock and roll riffs and stuff like that. It really had a big effect on me. A lot of killer stuff happened when I was that.
No, I mean, you talked back there a little bit ago about, learning Chuck's songs, realizing he was an almost Hendrix-like figure. But I mean, I think we all know he was both a poetic genius and a musical genius. But did he know he was a genius, or do you think he realized his talent?
Dude, that's a complicated answer. Can you give me like 10 seconds to think about that question for a minute?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I actually already have an answer for that. The band was Chuck Schuldiner, me, Steve DiGiorgio, and Gene Hoglan. I think, and we were all young. And I think at the time, I mean, we all knew that we were talented. You only see things, I think, sometimes like that in hindsight. Do you understand what I mean?
Oh yeah, completely.
So we knew we were good individually and collectively, and like we respected Chuck, and Chuck respected me, and I respected Gene, and everybody respected each other. But you know, a lot of times it's not till later that you can look back. Like I knew that Chuck was a good musician when I learned his music because it was angular rather than linear, and I realized, wow, this is good. I didn't realize though until years later how talented, he actually was. It's a hard thing to explain, man. That's the best answer I can give you.
Yeah.
I'll call you something else though. Speaking of things like that, one night, this was in the United States on tour. I don't know. It was either Steve or me. I don't remember which one of us it was, but one of us looked at each other. We're in the middle of one of the songs, and there's tapes of every show I ever did with that. And if people heard them, they're incredible. But one of us just started going off, and then either me or him, whoever was the other guy, started improvising together with him, while Chuck and Gene kept going in the song, and what we did worked. Then Gene started going with us, and this became a thing we started doing. And Chuck, after like 2 days, he came on the bus at the end of the night, and he's like, "Metal Brothers, this is death metal. It's not jazz." And we'd be like, all right. So we just do normal, and then like a day or two later, one of us would look at each other, and either Gene, Steve, or me would like do one like improvisation. Then we'd all go off while Chuck stayed on the song. Then we'd come back, and he'd be like, "Dudes, you guys gotta stop playing jazz. And we stop, and then we do it again.
Well, look, one thing I really want to ask is that, and this will be my last death question because I could literally go on probably forever, but this will be my last one. There is a characterization of Chuck out there, from the media, from videos, from everything. It's kind of twofold. One is of a little bit of a prima donna, right? The other is of a complete musical genius. But the third characterization is always of this kind of like softly spoken, guys, this kind of guy. What was he really, really like? Was he a kind of soft, fey, genius guy? Or was he quite a sort of musically controlling and determined character? What is the real Chuck?
Well, I mean, he definitely had that California sort of accent.
Yeah.
Like, he'd be like, Metal Brothers, stop improvising on my music.
Yeah.
And he did talk like that. It was funny, though. Like, he knew that we thought it was funny, and he would play it up, like, on stage, like, because he'd introduce everybody in the band. And when they were doing that album, I had named Steve DiGiorgio the hippie of doom because I got knocked in the head by a car seat trying to get in the back of the car with his big ass in front of me to go to dinner. It's like, oh, fuck, I got this hippie of doom on. So Chuck would be like, on bass, the hippie of doom, Steve DiGiorgio. And then when he called me the conjurer of old school vibrato, because I played kind of like Shanker.
Yeah.
And he'd be like, the conjurer of old school vibrato, blah, blah. But, like, it's impossible to really describe another human being to people that don't know me. It's like trying to tell someone, try to describe green.
Yeah.
You can't describe green. Chuck, he was a little bit, like, insular. Like he kind of sometimes seemed like he thought everybody was out to get him, which wasn't true. But at the same time, he gave me a career, like, just because I hung out at Morrisound and I could play guitar, and he would say incredibly kind things about my guitar playing to other people. But, he was a complicated person. I can't really... It's like this, man. Chuck died young. I was roughly the same age as him, and I'm 50 years old now. Like, when you're younger like that, I mean, the point I'm trying to make is people's personalities, like, they change over time. Like, I've gotten softer and softer. He was taken away from us, as a young man. He was a good guy, but he wasn't a one-dimensional person. And when people die young like that and tragically like that, people tend to lionize them and make them into saints. He was just a dude, like the rest of us are just dudes. He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't things that his enemies say about him either. He was just a guy.
Yeah.
And, I loved him, and he was very, very good to me.
But what I'm thinking about is he, long before his diagnosis and long before he was taken away from us, he had also had a very difficult time because I think to stuff like, I think it's either Together as One or Suicide Machine, I can't remember which, but is that not about the trauma that his sister suffered as a very young girl? Or something like that.
I actually, and I'm not lying to you, I'm not trying to avoid the question, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I know that I know what a couple of the songs on the Individual Thought Patterns are about.
Yeah.
And one of them is about somebody that I now consider a good friend, Bora Boy, who runs Blabbermouth. Chuck had a tendency to think that people were out to get him when they weren't. But as far as those other things, I don't know. I mean, The Philosopher, that's about Paul Masvidal.
Really?
And, I don't know what happened between them two dudes. But I think Paul's a nice guy, and he's an incredible musician. And I don't like getting involved in, like, you know what I mean? I don't like music business drama, and you know,
Yeah.
you'll never see me on the internet talking shit about somebody I work
No,
with or anything.
I mean,
It's
I'm
not.
not, I'm not, I'm not
No,
trying to
I'm not
make.
saying that you're trying to get me to do that.
No,
I'm
I'm not.
just saying.
But what strikes me though is that that's a really insightful thing to know, because you know, if you think about the key line from the Philosopher, which is, "You preach to me about how I'm supposed to be, yet you know not your own sexuality." I mean, that's a really, it can be quite hurtful. You know, that's really quite hurtful, I guess, isn't it? Somehow.
Dude, you know what, man? I didn't even think of that when I just said that, because I don't think I like Paul Masvidal a lot. I think he's a great musician, and I don't care about things like that.
Yeah.
So I didn't even think about that line.
Well, it just came into my head. I didn't think about it either. But it's what you're saying about Chuck not being a one-dimensional character, and we tend to lionize people, and yet there's one instance where that's a bit tough, really, isn't it?
I loved Chuck. I like Paul a lot. The other dudes that I mentioned, you know, Gene and Craig and Shannon and Richard, I love those guys. And Steve DiGiorgio is family to me.
So what an incredible conversation, of really honest, searingly honest actually, conversations from Ralph Santalla about his time with the incredible visionary Chuck Schuldiner and that amazing circle, that family of the Death musicians, that just incredible musical family and brotherhood that so many of us hold dear. The next episode will feature Ralph. We'll continue our conversation, and Ralph will talk about his time in Deicide, and he has particular praise for Steve Ashim as a real creative genius. I know a lot of us don't necessarily see that all the time, and so it's great to have Ralph talk that through. So episode 41 will be coming up next week. This has been the Metal Insight Podcast. I'm Earl Grey. If you want to advertise on this podcast, just get in touch. It's mi@metalireland.com. That's mi@metalireland.com. And I look forward to bringing you part 2 of this conversation next week. Over and out.